For a lot, I think COVID showed that most people, when push comes to shove, are happy to go along with government
Yeah.
mandates if that's what happened. And what you're talking about here, obviously, excuse me, I feel the same that most moral obligations should be socially enforced because we still, whether or not you want to include the government in the equation, we still have social obligations to one another.
Absolutely,
If
yeah.
one of the things that surrounds people who live a good life is that they have other people around them living good lives, that kind of reinforces itself. It's like a nice cycle. But I would say, doing some reading, I think that, especially after COVID, it's become clear to me that a lot of what we consider culture has been has first off been enforced through things like legislation and through things like government mandates, and people adapt around them, learn to get along with them, and then socially enforce from there once it's already ingrained. So, for instance, I always bring it up recently because it's a fantastic book, The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell, spoke about how the government used civil rights legislation, and you can make the argument, especially when you start to look into the civil rights movement, a lot of it was funded by some pretty shady characters, funded by some people with lots and lots of money, people like Nelson Rockefeller, who was a member of the Rockefeller family, so immediately you should be on guard and not trusting this person. After all, his, I think, father or grandfather, David Rockefeller, helped set up the Federal Reserve in the first place. So not a family to be trusted, not one that you should expect to be wanting to decentralize government power either. He was funding Martin Luther King, despite the fact that he was a Republican, but this was back when the Republicans and the Democrats kind of were mixed parties, or at least certainly much more so than they are now. So Nelson Rockefeller funded this and then helps to get the legislation passed through. There were lots of other groups doing the same thing that all wanted to get benefits from this. And then the legislation, the Civil Rights Act and the legislation that came after it, ended up creating a legal situation where it took a few decades to get hold properly, but it ended up creating a legal situation where most people, the behaviors that were normal to them before, say, for instance, hiring practices where you don't have to hire a certain amount of black people, and speech like the behavior and the kind of speech that you use, all of a sudden start to get policed more and more. Not necessarily because it's a natural occurrence within the social group that you're part of, but because people recognize the changes, the way that we see with wokeism nowadays. A lot of people who I know who 10 years ago were completely normal people, have got pronouns in their bio, they tone police, they police pronouns if you start talking about people, if you make any mention of anything to do with, say, like, for instance, gay marriage, or anything like that, these people freak. And this is not a natural occurrence. This is not because bottom-up society has changed organically in such a way. It's because of the fact that people recognize the social enforcement mechanisms changing around them, including just potentially being fired from your job, getting fined by the government, all these things, and they change their behavior accordingly. So I do think that as much as I would like for it to be more of an organic, natural thing, the standards that we enforce, I think for the first part at least, and this is going to make me sound like a bit of a social engineer, but only because everyone around me has been socially engineered to the point that we are right now. I think at first you will probably need some kind of legislation, or at least the removal of the legislation that we have at the moment, and some policies encouraging more wholesome behavior. Not necessarily prescribing things and not necessarily punishing things, more policies in the way that people recommend. Like in Hungary, they have the policies to encourage parents having children. Something like that, something that offers benefits to people for behaving in a certain way, rather than penalising people for
More
behaving
carrot
a
than
certain
stick.
way. Yeah, more carrot than stick. That's the best way to put it.
Yeah, and obviously I don't disagree that the government and law influence people's attitudes. That's pretty undeniable, and you used a very good example for it. But I think that quite often we look at the issue in a way, not saying that you do necessarily, but we look at the issue as in it being a single direction, in that it's all top down. But I think that it's a lot more complicated than that, in that there's exchange where society changes and then the laws follow suit, and vice versa. I think there's more of a bi-directional relationship between the two, because how are you going to get the ideas for the government in the first place if they're not already circulating in the society?
Well, I agree with that, But to bring in some elite theory,
Okay, yeah, of course.
a little bit, those tend to come not from necessarily the people, so to speak, but from opposing centers of power. So other elite groups combating other elite groups force each other to make compromises and change things.
I mean, societal elites are the ones that generate the ideas, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're, say, at a university, you could be classified as an elite, and they're the ones that are trying to push the forefronts of knowledge or regress it in many cases, depending on which department they're in. But I think that it's a complicated relationship, and government can be used to change attitudes. But then there's also the example of we don't agree with the government, even though
No, not at all.
we've gone for our whole lives effectively trying to be programmed by the government to behave like good citizens. And if anything, I've become more and more disaffected with the government message as I've gotten older, rather than more and more influenced by it. So it goes to show that there are certain people that are independently minded and can't be influenced. And I would argue, this is perhaps my own personal bias here, that people who go along with the whims of the government are conformists by nature, and therefore they're always going to conform to something, and it's just a matter of getting the right thing.
Well, I think
it's a sort of personality disposition rather than it being something that can affect every single person.
I think most people tend to be quite conformist by nature. For the most part, people are willing to go along to get along. You know, most people just want an easy life, but it's when we get to the extremes that we've experienced in more recent years where all of a sudden the government is enforcing things like transgender ideology and encouraging policies and positions that will inevitably lead to more people's children potentially castrating themselves and going through these irreversible surgeries without having to get the parents' permission first. That's when you suddenly start to come up against the edges of how far you can push people before they turn. And I think those people like ourselves, who are naturally a bit less conformist, who want to explore and discover other ideas, who aren't afraid to go outside the boundaries of the Overton window and acceptable discussion.
I'm sure many of the audience are
yes,
that
of
way
course, the
inclined
audience as well. I'm sure that's where these opposing elite power centers can emerge if we start to politically organize in such a way.
And I think that the transgender example is actually a good example of something where I think government is necessary, because if some of the more extreme libertarians, I feel like extreme's probably not the right word, but the more...
I think radical is a term that they would actually happily accept.
Okay, the ones who would say, okay, any government intervention is bad, this is where I would disagree with them, because I would say, well, protecting the rights of children from potential parental abuse is somewhere where government should step in to defend the rights of the children, right?
And if we go on further, this will be a point that I bring up when I think we'll carry on with the document in a moment, but just to lay the seeds for it. So I generally see that there are two kinds of libertarian, or at least two strains of major libertarianism that can intermingle with each other, but when you get one who's on entirely one side and entirely on the other side, that's when you tend to get the crazies, or at least the crazy ideas banded about, because Rothbard was definitely purely one side, and he wasn't crazy per se, but he did put some crazy ideas forward. And those two strains are the economic efficiency libertarianism, where you have people like Steve Baker, for instance, who is more than happy to use the government and be part of the government and push socially leftist causes, as long as he can encourage policies that he thinks will make line on graph go up. And then you have the purely rights-orientated libertarians, and they're probably much closer to pure libertarianism, because they're looking at things through a natural rights, natural law perspective.
That's more
and
my neck of the woods,
Yeah, and trying to figure out certain principles. It's kind of a bit Kantian. They kind of have an air of the categorical imperative about them, which is where I think they can go wrong, which is they try and come up with principles and rules that can apply to all situations in all times.
Yeah, I think that this is something that I have a gripe with as well, because trying to kind of extract universals out of things is always very, very difficult, because human beings are incredibly complicated things, and we've got such individual variations between one another that what might be perfectly right and ordinary for one person might be the complete opposite for someone else. And I think that applying these sorts of things blanketly over everyone is part of the reason why libertarians are anti-government in the first place. So just because you're applying your abstract principles and they're not, government force, doesn't mean that the root of the problem is any different between the two things.
Yeah, and this is something that Rothbard and Hopper are pretty explicit about, that what they are doing is, well, Rothbard employs empirical examples sometimes, but a lot of what they talk about is that the method for coming up with libertarian principles and the method for libertarian economics should be purely abstract, unless there's a situation where you just can't be purely abstract. So, for instance, in Man State
in the Economy.
I think it's Man, Economy and State.
Oh,
yeah, no, I was getting it wrong anyway. In Man, Economy and State, Rothbard talks about, obviously, it's his big economic treatise, and he's talking about all of these abstract principles that he's concocted, but he does have to give leeway for one thing, and one thing alone in his system, that he has to take from empirical evidence rather than abstract theorizing, which is the idea that human beings love leisure, and leisure itself can be considered a commodity that has to be weighed up against other ones. Because purely by abstract theorizing, you would not just necessarily assume, especially when you consider the rational economic man that Mises and Rothbard were working under the assumption of, that this man is also going to potentially just want to be very lazy and sit around and do nothing all day. You're not going to take that into account. So he had to take that from his empirical observations of just the real world, that, yeah, people can be really lazy. So you do have those, but a lot of it tends to be, we get first principles and then we abstract out from there.
I find that looking at things in the abstract is a very reductionist way of looking at the world, in that I would much rather look at things empirically, because actually the model of human nature that many libertarians have isn't actually very accurate, in that...
No, and this is one of my criticisms of the more purist style libertarianism.
In that people aren't nearly as rational as many of especially the economists, would like to believe.
Would you like a quote just to really make it clear how they go wrong on human nature? And obviously this is taken from Man, Economy and State. I keep getting it wrong. I even had it right in front of me on my document here. I have been doing a lot of work recently reading through things so that I can try and come up with my good faith critique of libertarianism, and I'm still a ways to go yet, just in case anybody gets excited, because there is a lot of reading that is necessary for this. But let me see if I can find it, because in here I was expecting, from what I'd been sold when I started reading it, and for the most part it would be a value-free judgment of economic principles.
There are no value-free judgments.
Well, that's the thing, is that Rothbard felt the need to fit something in here anyway. Let me see if I've got all my quotes from here. I think it's from page 100. Here we go. So this is Rothbard's account from his abstract principles and theorizing of why it is that society came together in the first place. Now, you've done a lot of studying into this, so I know that you'll be able to correct where this goes wrong, from your understanding of psychology and your understanding of how human societies formed in the past. So he says, an interesting aspect of this praxeological truth is that this benefit to others occurs regardless of them. Oh wait, no, this is when he talks about the benefits of the free market, meaning you don't have to intentionally help people to end up helping people anyway. So he says, he goes through that, and then he says, thus, in explaining the origins of society, there is no need to conjure up any mystic communion or sense of belonging among individuals. Individuals recognize, through the use of reason, the advantages of exchange resulting from the higher productivity of the division of labor, and they proceed to follow this advantageous course. In fact, it is far more likely that feelings of friendship and communion are the effects of a regime of contractual social cooperation rather than the cause. So what he's stating there is that people only form society because they ended up trading in the state of nature, Lockean sense. They were atomized individuals who ended up trading with one another, realizing there were benefits, and then forming a society as a result. Now, that might work in the group level. Groups, I reckon, probably did end up trading with each other and then assimilating as a result of the benefits.
But not at the individual level.
But not at the individual level.
Yeah.
And that's a big place where libertarian falls on its face for me, because that is not, one, that's not a value-free judgment. That is assuming the atomized individual state of nature. And then it is also just completely wrong. Through reading Jonathan Haidt, I learned this, and I'm sure through your own studies.
Yeah.
Human beings evolved socially. We evolved in groups, and we evolved.
We're group animals, yes.
Yeah, we evolved through that group selection to pick the people who worked best in groups were the ones who were surviving as well. So
Yes.
it wasn't just that we have this natural inclination, it's that through evolutionary processes, we developed even more.
This
that
is
social
true even of
inclination.
non-human primates as well.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.